It was a Tuesday morning soaked in a soft, silent kind of light, the kind that only touches small towns buried deep in the Midwest after a long, unforgiving winter. The air still held the smell of thawing earth, pine, and yesterday's rain. Overhead, clouds moved slow like old men crossing the street, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, twice, then no more. All of this felt like background noise to what was about to happen. The man stepped out of a pickup that had long outlived its prime, faded blue with a dented bumper and a sticker on the back window that read Semper Fi. He was tall but not imposing, lean but wiry like a man used to carrying more weight than his frame should allow. His jacket was old canvas, army green, and frayed at the cuffs. His boots were polished, though not for show. There was something unmistakably practiced in the way he moved, deliberate, quiet, as if he had learned a long time ago how not to draw attention. In his hand, folded twice and gripped like something fragile, was a check. Government issued. Compensation for something no government could ever really repay. He crossed Main Street slowly. Nobody looked twice. People in towns like this didn't ask questions unless they had to. Still, a few glanced his way, curious but polite. He opened the bank's glass door with the same gentleness he'd used to open a hospital room or a letter from an old friend. A small bell chimed overhead, crisp against the stillness inside. The bank was warm, quiet, nearly empty, except for the young teller behind the counter and the manager in the corner office. The teller looked up, smiled politely, then faltered when she saw the check. Her name tag read Rachel. Her eyes darted to the number on the paper, then to the man's face, then quickly back again. "Just a moment," she said, voice tight, already rising from her chair. He nodded, silent, calm. Moments later, the manager came out. Mid-40s, clean suit, the kind of man who had learned how to smile without meaning it. He took the check, turned it over, read the name, Walter J. Beckett, and blinked. "This is quite a large amount, sir," the manager said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Can I ask where this check came from?" Walter looked him in the eye. There was no hostility in his gaze, only an unbearable calm. "It's a government disbursement," he replied. "Department of Defense." The manager hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Do you have any identification?" Walter nodded and handed over a wallet with the efficiency of muscle memory. The manager took it, examined the ID, and still didn't move. "I'll just need to verify this. Would you mind stepping into the side room while we do?" It wasn't a question. Walter didn't argue. He simply followed, his steps soundless on the polished floor. Behind the glass wall, Rachel watched him disappear into the small room with the door that never closed properly. She glanced down at the check still visible on the counter. Her eyes widened again, 8 digits, government seal, and a signature that might have belonged to a secretary of something. She didn't know what it was for. But she knew one thing for sure. Nobody handed out that kind of money to just anyone. Back inside the side room, Walter sat down without being asked. He placed his hands on the table in front of him, palms down. His knuckles were worn, scarred. His nails clipped clean. He said nothing. The manager made a few calls, quiet, rapid, urgent. Words like suspicious activity and potential fraud floated through the thin air like smoke. Walter remained still, like a man who had waited in rooms before, in silence, while others decided what to do with him. He looked out the window. The clouds were still moving. A bird landed on the sidewalk across the street. 2 kids passed by on bicycles, laughing free. He blinked once, slowly. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised, because he'd known this would happen. "Would you like me to continue to part 2? The suspicion and surveillance?" The waiting room of the bank felt colder now, though nothing had changed in the air. Walter sat unmoving, back straight, but his mind wandered far from the hum of office phones and the dry voice of the bank manager still whispering behind the frosted glass. Time was a strange thing. It never moved the same way twice. Sometimes it crawled. Sometimes it folded in on itself. Now, for him, it fractured, slipping back into memories he never invited, but which always came when silence grew too loud. He thought of her, Helen. She used to smile when she spoke his name. Not lately. Not in the last few years. Now her voice cracked like glass under heat. Sharp, brittle, too tired to be angry, but too cold to be warm. They still shared a house, a mortgage, a quiet routine that looked like marriage from the outside. But the heart of it, whatever it had once been, was now hollow. Not broken. Just emptied out like a home people used to live in, but abandoned slowly, one piece of furniture at a time. She hadn't asked about the check. She hadn't asked about the war in years. Not since the last time he woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, clawing at something only he could see. He remembered the way she looked at him then, not with fear, but something worse. Pity. And distance. Like she was already 3 steps further out the door but hadn't figured out how to say goodbye yet. He had tried, in the beginning, to explain. To tell her what it meant to carry things you couldn't name. About the weight of men lost and things done in silence. About the silence itself. How it grew inside a man until it turned everything else to ash. But how do you explain ghosts to someone who's never been haunted? Now, they didn't talk about it. They talked about groceries. The weather. The dog's medication. Taxes. They slept in the same bed but touched like strangers. Occasional. Accidental. He missed her fingers in his hair. Her breath on his chest. Her laugh. God, her laugh used to feel like sunlight. But war had a way of rearranging everything. It didn't just kill people. It killed moments. It scattered pieces of you across places and years you could never return to. When the check arrived, an envelope stamped with bureaucratic formality, cold and impersonal, he placed it on the kitchen table without a word. Helen looked at it, then at him. Her eyes narrowed, unreadable. "What's that?" she asked, not moving. He shrugged. "Back pay. Injury. They called it a reconciliation adjustment." She nodded once. Not out of understanding. Just acknowledgement. Then she turned away, back to the sink, and that was that. They didn't speak of it again. Now, inside the glass room, he wondered if she'd be home when he got back. Some days she was. Some days, she went to her sister's without telling him. Sometimes, she left a note. Sometimes not. He never called.
He didn't want to sound like he was checking in.
Like he was afraid. Like he still needed things he wasn't allowed to need anymore. He exhaled slowly, and it came out heavy. The manager re-entered the room, papers in hand, face composed like someone who had practiced looking apologetic without actually meaning it. "There's just been a procedural delay," he said. "We'll need to hold the funds for verification. I'm sure you understand." Walter nodded. Not because he understood, but because he'd stopped expecting people to. They never saw it, the years. The losses. The damn effort it took just to keep breathing some days. They just saw a man with a check and a quiet face and a story too neat to trust. He took the check back, slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. "Have a good day," the manager said, but Walter was already out the door. He stepped back into the light, though it no longer looked like light to him. Just brightness. Just weather. He crossed the street again, slower this time, like he was walking not through town, but through the years between who he had been and who he had become. In the distance, someone was laughing. He looked toward the sound but saw no one. Just wind moving through empty spaces. He got in the truck, shut the door, and sat with his hands on the wheel, not starting the engine. Just sitting. Thinking. About Helen. About the silence between them. About whether he could still find his way back. Or whether he was already too far gone. Then, without a word, he turned the key and drove away. Not toward home. Not yet. Just away. The diner sat 2 blocks down from the bank, its windows fogged with the ghosts of 100 quiet mornings. Walter pulled into the gravel lot, engine humming low before dying out, and stared for a moment at the chipped red and white sign overhead. Linda's Place, a name as unassuming as the woman who ran it. He hadn't planned on stopping. But the air inside the truck had grown too tight, too heavy. He needed something warm. Not food. Not coffee. Just warmth. Even pretend warmth would do. Inside, the bell above the door gave a half-hearted jingle. The place smelled like burnt toast and memory. Vinyl booths cracked at the edges, formica counters dulled by time. A country song played low from an old jukebox in the corner, the voice soft, wounded. It reminded him of something he couldn't name. Behind the counter stood a girl.
Young.
Maybe mid-20s. Stringy hair, green sweater a size too big. She looked up when she saw him. Not with curiosity, not exactly, but something that hovered near recognition. Like she'd seen him before. Like she'd been waiting. "You're the vet with the check, right?" she said, before he even sat down. Walter stopped mid-step. His hand hovered above the stool. "I saw you go into the bank," she added, quieter now, almost sheepish. "I work at the title office next door."
Sorry.
Small town. He sat. Slowly. Didn't think anyone noticed. She poured coffee, without asking. Steam rose between them, a makeshift wall against the world. "People notice more than they let on," she said, voice soft, eyes sharp. "Especially when men in uniform come back and start moving money the government's been sitting on for 20 years. He studied her. There was no malice in her tone. Just observation. She slid the mug toward him and leaned on the counter with a kind of ease that came from living in places where stories outpaced facts. "What's your name?" he asked. "Kelly." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and glanced around the empty diner. "My uncle was in Iraq," she said. "He got one of those checks too. Couple years back. Only his never cleared." Walter frowned. "What do you mean?" Kelly lowered her voice. "I mean it bounced. Not because it wasn't real, but because someone flagged it. Said the signature didn't match. Said he was impersonating a dead man." Her lips tightened. "He wasn't. I was at the funeral. He buried 3 of his guys." A silence thickened between them. Walter felt the familiar throb behind his temples, the one that came not from pain, but recognition. Like the wind had changed and nobody else noticed but you. "They said it was a clerical thing," Callie went on, wiping at a smudge on the counter that didn't exist. "But he started getting these weird calls. No caller ID. Just breathing. Clicks. Then his mailbox got broken into. Someone went through his trash. He thought he was being paranoid. But he stopped sleeping. Stopped answering the door. One day he just left." "Where?" She shook her head. "Didn't say. Just left a note. Tell him I wasn't crazy. That was it." Walter's jaw tightened. He felt the paper inside his coat like it was burning through the fabric. The check. The one that now felt less like compensation and more like bait. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Callie met his eyes. "Because I think something's happening, Mr. Ward. And I think you're part of it whether you want to be or not." He didn't answer. He couldn't. His thoughts were a sudden avalanche. Memories of men he hadn't spoken to in years, of funerals no one attended, of emails gone unanswered. And now this. A girl in a diner who knew too much and didn't seem afraid to say it. She reached under the counter, pulled out a manila envelope, and slid it to him. "I made copies," she said. "Bank records. Communications logs. Names. A few connections. Some of it won't make sense. Not yet." He stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. Callie leaned in. "You're not the only one they're watching." The jukebox switched to a new song, something old, slow, bluesy. Outside, the light shifted. Clouds gathering. Rain maybe. Or just shadow. Walter stood slowly, the envelope in hand now, heavier than it looked. Callie didn't speak again. Just nodded once, like they'd made a deal, without speaking. Like something had shifted, and there was no unknowing it now. He stepped outside into the gray light, the wind colder, the street suddenly unfamiliar in its quiet. The town hadn't changed, but the shape of it had. The feel. Inside his coat, the check rustled. Inside his other hand, the envelope pulsed with unsaid truths. He walked to the truck and didn't look back.
Not yet.
Not until he knew who, or what, was behind the curtain. The war wasn't over. It had just changed its name. He drove with both hands on the wheel, but his mind was somewhere else. Back there, back then. The envelope from Callie sat unopened on the passenger seat like a second conscience, one he wasn't ready to face yet. But he would. He knew it. Just not on the road, not while his hands still remembered how to shoot, how to steer, how to kill. The truth had a way of announcing itself, without ceremony. No trumpet, no warning, just a whisper that settled behind your ribs and refused to leave. And right now, it was whispering names he hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. Hollis, Ramirez, Taggart, and Morrison. The name landed like a cold knife in his chest. Morrison.
Captain.
Warborn. Silver-starred and soft-spoken. The kind of man who looked you in the eye while sending you into hell. Walter had followed him once. Trusted him. Bled for him. He'd watched Morrison stand in a jungle clearing one dawn, calm as Sunday, reading off mission coordinates, while mortars dropped like thunder just beyond the hill. The kind of man you didn't question, until it was too late. He pulled into the old lumberyard, long abandoned, weeds tall. The roof collapsed on one side. No cameras here. No eyes. He opened the envelope slowly, fingers rough on the edges. Inside were copies, bank transfers, deployment rosters, internal memos with names blacked out, then rewritten in faint pencil. A string of dots that began in Kandahar and ended in places like Fort Detrick, Langley, Bethesda. The kind of places that didn't make sense until you looked at them sideways. And there it was, Morrison's name. Not dead. Not discharged. Reassigned. Walter's mouth went dry. His eyes scanned the line again. Reassigned. Strategic Compliance Initiative. Clearance. Omega Black. It wasn't just back pay.
The check.
That envelope wasn't a reward. It was a lever. An invitation. A test. He remembered the mission now. The one they never wrote down. The one no one was supposed to talk about. Deep in the mountains, with intel so clean it smelled like bait. They'd found the village empty, almost too quiet, like the people knew what was coming. Except they hadn't. Not the kids. Not the women. Just numbers now, chalked on walls, tagged for aerial confirmation. Walter had argued then. Morrison had shut it down. Orders are orders, he'd said. But when the dust cleared and the body count came in, it wasn't Morrison who signed the report. It was Walter. Morrison vanished 3 days later. The medals came soon after. And now here it was, staring him in the face. Those same ghost operations, coded and disguised, connected to payouts, fake death records, and an internal clearance list that ended with 7 names. 6 crossed out. His was the 7th. Betrayal had a taste, and he could feel it now in the back of his throat, metallic, bitter, old. He had been kept alive, not by mercy, but by design. And now the same people who buried the past were poking it with a stick to see if it still breathed. He knew what came next. Surveillance. Isolation. Character assassination. Discredit, then disappear. But not quietly. They'd want to control the narrative. He stood there in the broken shell of the warehouse, documents fanned out on a dusty workbench, and felt the weight of something he hadn't felt since the war. Resolve. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger was noisy. What he felt now was colder. Sharper. He looked down at the last photo in the file. Grainy. Satellite view. A compound nestled in woods, no markings. But he knew that pattern. The fencing. The shape of the guard rotations. It was Morrison's signature. Like a ghost had signed his name in ink only Walter could read. So it was true. Morrison hadn't just survived. He had thrived. Shielded. Promoted. And now he was building something again in secret. Whatever it was, Walter was part of it. Or a threat to it. And the check? It wasn't hush money. It was bait. And Walter had taken it. He gathered the documents, folded them tight, slid them back into the envelope like packing a wound you couldn't close. As he stepped out into the dusk, the air felt sharper, charged. A crow overhead split the sky with its cry, and he watched it disappear across the treeline. Alone. Unafraid. He didn't go home.
Not yet.
Helen didn't deserve to be dragged into this. Not when she'd spent years trying to forget what he couldn't. There was a payphone still working down on 5th, behind the liquor store. He needed a number. Someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A man with burn scars and a voice like sandpaper who used to fix radios in the desert and listen to things he wasn't supposed to hear. Walter walked back to the truck. He didn't look at the check again. The war had found him. And this time, it wore a suit and carried a briefcase. The call went through after the fifth ring. A low, gravel-voiced whisper answered. No greeting, just the static hum of someone who lived behind lines, of law, of loyalty, of time. It's Walter. A pause. Then, Jesus Christ. You still breathing? Barely, he said. I need eyes. Off-grid. Something called Strategic Compliance Initiative. Omega Black Clearance. They're tied to Morrison. That name alone turned the silence heavy. Then the voice returned, brittle and cautious. You sure you want to kick that hornet's nest, Walt? I already did. The line clicked. The man on the other end hung up, but Walter knew what that meant. The next time they spoke, he'd have answers. In that world, silence was a promise. He drove through the night, eyes scanning the rear view. No tail.
Not yet.
But the rhythm of a covert machine wasn't like civilian life. It didn't knock. It seeped in, showed up in delayed mail, in strangers asking too many questions, in your wife's medication being out of stock for 3 days straight, death by inconvenience. By morning, a package arrived at a P.O. box he hadn't used in 9 years. Inside was a thumb drive, no label, no note. He plugged it into an old laptop, stripped of all wireless functions, shielded with aluminum mesh. Paranoia had never left him. It had just aged into routine. The screen filled with documents, redacted memos, procurement contracts under shell companies, a network diagram that looked less like a business and more like a spider's web, threads crossing through the Pentagon, the Department of Agriculture, even the Red Cross. That was Morrison's genius. He'd built something that looked legitimate from every angle because it was on paper. But buried in those lines were the ghosts. Operations labeled compliance architecture and urban stabilization, which, in field reports, translated into unauthorized surveillance, targeted harassment, medical experimentation, and in one case, civilian displacement under pretense of emergency evacuation. It was black ops, but not military. It was corporate, privatized, beyond oversight. And Walter had just scratched the surface. The deeper he read, the colder he became. This wasn't about revenge. It was about design. Someone had watched the fall of the war machine, then rebuilt it in the shadows of bureaucracy and budget lines. They didn't wear stars. They wore name tags and carried NDAs. And at the center of it all, Morrison. There was video, too. Leaked footage from a drone cam. Not grainy.
Clean.
Time-stamped. Morrison walking through the compound, giving orders.
Alive.
Smiling. Behind him, a man in a lab coat and 2 others bound.
Drugged.
Their faces blurred. Experimental compliance therapy. Walter felt something inside him harden. It wasn't rage. Rage was loud and temporary. This was different. This was tectonic. He knew what he had to do. He didn't storm the gates. He mailed one package to a woman named Elise Trent, journalist, former war correspondent, once embedded with his unit. She owed him her spine. He'd dragged her bleeding from a crumbling shack in Fallujah. Now he needed her words. He sent her the entire drive. No name. No return address. Just one line, handwritten in black ink. Truth doesn't need a badge. Just daylight. But even as he acted, the circle began to close. A black SUV started parking across from his home every morning. Helen's brake lines were cut, twice. His neighbor's dog disappeared.
Petty.
Predictable. Desperate. He left Helen a letter. Not an apology. Just the truth in his own words. Then he disappeared. 2 days later, Elise went live on an independent network. She didn't blink. She named names. She showed faces. She ended her broadcast with a single sentence. This isn't whistleblowing. This is war. The government denied everything. Official channels called it a foreign misinformation campaign. But it was too late. Other names began coming forward, retired analysts, grieving families, a former nurse from the facility Walter had identified. The web had unraveled. But Walter? He didn't stick around to see the fallout. He was already on the move, carrying only what he needed, back into the shadows he knew too well. He wasn't done. Morrison was still out there. And for the first time in years, Walter felt something like clarity, not peace, but purpose. Because exposing the crime wasn't enough. He had to finish it. Walter never believed in redemption. Not the kind you read in books or heard in sermons. The real kind didn't come with hallelujahs or forgiveness. It came in choices. Quiet ones. Bloody ones. It came when you stood at the edge of something foul and decided you wouldn't flinch, not again. He had seen the fallout unfold from motels and truck stops, his face reflected in cracked mirrors, unshaven, eyes lined with a quiet fury. Elise's broadcast had been a spark, but fire needed oxygen, and Morrison's machine was suffocating the world fast. The leak had rattled cages, but it hadn't broken them. Morrison hadn't gone into hiding. He'd doubled security. The bastard was preparing for a counterstrike. Walter didn't run. He planned. He built a small arsenal, nothing loud, nothing that screamed vengeance. He was too old for theatrics. What he carried now were tools. Encrypted drives, thermal scopes, an old Israeli sat phone, forged ID under a name no one would remember. He visited 3 graves, men who had once shared blood and silence with him. At each one he left a coin, dog tags, and a promise. You were right. I should have burned it all down then. Now he would. He made contact with the last of the old crew, only 2 still breathing. Taggart, who now lived in a trailer by a swamp in Georgia, haunted and half-mad. And Ramirez, who walked with a cane and carried a rage like rusted steel. They didn't ask why he was calling. They knew. Walter didn't even have to say the name. Morrison. 1 word. And everything snapped into place. They met under cover of rain, in a diner that reeked of burnt coffee and old paper. Taggart slid him a flash drive. Satellite logs. Your boy's building something big. Deep in Oregon. Old logging site turned into a compound. Walter stared out the window, then asked the only question that mattered. Do you still believe in justice? Taggart chuckled, voice like gravel. I believe in ghosts. I believe they need to rest. Ramirez leaned in, eyes glassy but sharp. Let's put him in the ground, Walter. Quiet. Final. No flags. No funerals. The plan wasn't sophisticated. That was the point. Morrison had built walls, tech, layers of men with guns and lawyers, but like all tyrants, he never looked for ghosts. Walter and his brothers would come through the places no cameras covered. Past tunnels once used for mining, now forgotten. They would not fire unless they had to. This wasn't war. This was correction. They moved in after midnight, cloaked in fog and silence. The compound was all angles and steel, sterile and soulless. Walter moved like memory itself, unseen, patient, unfinished. 1 guard went down with a whisper. Another fell asleep with help from a needle in his thigh. No alarms. No bloodlust. Just precision. Walter found Morrison alone in a control room, sipping whiskey, eyes flicking over dozens of screens, none of which showed the entrance Walter had used. He didn't raise his gun. He just stepped into the light and let Morrison see the past walk in. You're supposed to be dead, Morrison said. His voice hadn't changed, cool, casual, like they were at a reunion. Walter smiled, thin and tired. You were supposed to be buried under court-martial transcripts and shame. Morrison chuckled, stood slowly, no panic in his movements. You leaked it all. Clever. But truth dies fast these days. A good story still wins. Walter walked closer. His hand didn't tremble. Not this time. He tossed a flash drive onto the table. This goes to every major tribunal. Military. Civilian. International. There's enough there to bring down everyone you ever protected. Morrison looked at the drive, then back at Walter. And you think they'll care? You think they want justice? No, Walter said softly. I do. Then he drew the gun not to kill, just to decide. And in that moment, Morrison realized what true fear looked like. Not violence, but conviction. He dropped to his knees. Walter didn't shoot. He called Elise.
Send the story, he said.
With the voice recording I just sent you. You got him? I got him living. And he hung up. By morning, Morrison was in custody, stripped, broken, and very much alive. The media storm swallowed the government in days. Public hearings followed. Whistleblowers multiplied. Laws were rewritten. Facilities were closed. The House of Shadows began to fall. Walter never gave a speech. He didn't shake hands. He refused medals. He disappeared again, this time for good. Helen received a letter 6 weeks later. It was short. Justice wasn't about winning. It was about remembering. I remember everything. I remember us. Inside was a photo. Walter.
Young. Smiling.
Holding her hand. And for the first time in years, Helen cried not for loss, but for peace. Because somewhere out there, her husband had finally finished something. Not for country. Not for honor. For truth. For ghosts. For justice.